In the shadowed hollows of American history, where the ink of official records dries thin, some stories are not lost but deliberately buried. They are the accounts of families so rooted in the country's dark soil that their existence becomes a quiet wound upon the landscape, a tale told only in whispers around dying fires. This is one such account, a narrative exhumed from the brittle pages of forgotten ledgers and the fragmented memories of a land that has tried and failed to forget. For on a lonely ridge in Appalachia, a family took root whose name was synonymous not with life, but with a uniquely patient and profound form of evil, a legacy of cruelty that has waited generations to be unearthed. If the obscured chapters of the past demand your attention, and you are new to this archive, consider subscribing to ensure you are present as we unseal each disquieting file. The story begins in the latter years of the 19th century, a time when the last vestiges of the frontier were being tamed and mapped, its wildness pressed into the neat grid lines of deeds and census reports. Yet, some places resisted this taming. In the deep folds of the Appalachian Mountains, there were ridges and valleys that seemed to exist outside of time, where the modern world was a distant rumor. It was to one such place that the family first came, arriving not with the fanfare of new settlers seeking community, but with the silence of a shadow stretching over the land at dusk. No one in the nearest settlement, a small, struggling township nestled in the valley below, could recall seeing their wagon train arrive. They simply appeared one season, their presence announced by the sharp, rhythmic crack of axes echoing from a ridge that had, until then, been considered uninhabitable, a place of gnarled trees and poor, rocky soil. The patriarch was a man named Hezekiah, a figure who seemed carved from the very hickory and stone of the mountains themselves. In the few instances he was seen in town, procuring salt, iron nails, and other bare necessities, he moved with a stark, unnerving economy of motion. He was tall and gaunt, his face a mask of hard lines and deep-set eyes that seemed to absorb the light around them. The townspeople noted his hands, which were large and calloused, yet possessed a strange dexterity. One of the few humanizing details ever recorded about him came from the town's blacksmith, who observed Hezekiah examining a hand-carved draft horse on the general store's counter. For a fleeting moment, the blacksmith saw a flicker of what he thought was professional appreciation in the man's otherwise vacant gaze, a brief acknowledgement of the skill required to shape wood with such precision. This fleeting observation would later be recalled with a shudder, as the community came to understand that the patriarch's talent for shaping things was not limited to inanimate materials. Hezekiah and his family did not build a homestead in the conventional sense. They erected a dark, formidable structure on the highest point of the ridge, a cabin made from black pine logs, with a roof that pitched at an unnaturally steep angle, as if designed to shed something heavier than snow. The windows were few and narrow, resembling arrow slits in a fortress more than openings meant to let in the sun. The placement of the house was itself a statement of intent. It overlooked the entire valley, a silent, brooding sentinel that was visible for miles. From their perch, the family could observe the daily comings and goings of every farmer and trapper, while they themselves remained obscured by the dense, thorny thicket they allowed to grow wild around their property line. They sought no neighbors and offered no welcome. Their land was not merely private, it felt claimed by a sovereignty that did not recognize the laws of the county or the customs of man. The family's isolation was an act of deliberate and profound separation. They were a self-contained unit, a world unto themselves on that desolate spine of rock and earth. The children, whose numbers were a matter of constant, whispered speculation, were never seen attending the small church school in the valley. The wife remained a phantom, a fleeting shape glimpsed from a distance, always clad in dark, homespun cloth that made her indistinguishable from the shadows that clung to the edges of their cleared land. They did not participate in the communal harvests, nor did they appear at town gatherings. Their rejection of the community was so absolute, so complete, that it ceased to be seen as mere reclusiveness. It felt like a judgment. It felt as though they had looked upon the small, struggling world of their neighbors and found it wanting, a sentiment that the townspeople began to return with a growing sense of unease. This unease soon curdled into a palpable fear, nurtured by a pattern of quiet, creeping intimidation. No overt threats were ever made, no crosswords exchanged. The family's aggression was of a more insidious and unnerving nature. A farmer named Jedediah, whose land bordered the base of the ridge, awoke one morning to find his property line moved a full 20 yards inward, the old stone markers replaced with sharpened, fire-hardened stakes that seemed to have grown from the ground overnight. There were no tracks, no sign of the labor that would have been required to move the heavy stones. When Jedediah attempted to restore the original boundary, his tools vanished from his hands the moment he turned his back. He later found them broken and buried beneath a cairn of stones at the edge of the family's thicket, a clear and silent warning. Others experienced similar, inexplicable incursions. A freshwater spring that had served 3 families for a generation suddenly turned brackish and foul, the water thick with a black, oily sediment that smelled of stagnant earth. The affliction began the day after one of the farmers had spoken aloud in the general store, wondering what sort of people would raise a family on such a cursed piece of land. The timing felt too precise to be a coincidence. It was as if the ridge itself could hear the thoughts and words of those below, and responded with a slow, methodical poison. The intimidation was never violent, but it was relentless. It was the quiet pressure of a coiled snake, a constant, unspoken threat that frayed the nerves of the entire community and reinforced the ridge's status as a place to be avoided at all costs. Then came the sounds. On moonless nights, when the wind swept down from the high peaks, it carried with it noises from the family's homestead that defied easy explanation. It was not the sound of revelry or of human conflict. It was something more ancient, more ritualistic. Some described it as a low, guttural chanting, a rhythmic cadence that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth. Others spoke of a high-pitched, resonant hum, a vibration that traveled through the soles of their feet and set their teeth on edge. The animals were the first to react. Dogs would whine and cower in barns, refusing to venture outdoors. The horses would grow agitated in their stalls, their eyes wide with a terror that their owners could not comprehend. The sounds were a violation, an auditory trespass that turned the quiet nights of the valley into a time of anxious listening. The vanishing of livestock began subtly, a missing chicken here, a lost lamb there. These were common enough occurrences in the mountains, easily attributable to foxes or wolves. But the pattern that emerged was anything but natural. The animals that disappeared were always the strongest, the healthiest of the flock. A prize-winning sow owned by a farmer named Philemon vanished from a locked pen, the heavy wooden gate still barred from the outside. No tracks were found leading in or out of the enclosure. Weeks later, Philemon found a single, impossibly clean femur bone resting on his doorstep, scrubbed of all flesh and marrow, a sterile and mocking trophy. Another farmer lost a bull, a massive creature weighing nearly a ton. The search party found nothing, not a single hoof print beyond the edge of its pasture, which ended abruptly at the base of the family's ridge. It was as if the 1,000-pound animal had been lifted into the air, plucked from the earth without a struggle. These incidents, unsettling as they were, remained in the realm of rumor and fearful speculation. They were anecdotes shared in hushed tones, stories that lacked the hard finality of evidence. That changed with the discovery of the daguerreotype. The image was found in the wreckage of a peddler's cart that had overturned on a treacherous stretch of road leading away from the mountains. The peddler himself was never located, but among his scattered wares was a small, leather-bound case containing a single tarnished silver plate. When cleaned, it revealed the only known likeness of the family, a portrait of such profound strangeness that it transformed whispered fears into a cold, documented certainty. An archivist examining the object today would first note its physical properties. The silver plate is heavy, the image upon it possessing the eerie, reflective quality unique to the daguerreotype process. The family is assembled before their dark cabin, posed in the rigid, formal posture required by the long exposure times of the era. Hezekiah stands at the center, his hand resting on the shoulder of a woman presumed to be his wife. Around them are clustered at least 4 children of varying ages. But the details of the portrait are what command and hold the observer's attention. Every face is unnaturally blurred, a milky haze that obscures their features. It is not the typical blur of movement, a slight turn of the head during the exposure. It is a deeper, more integral distortion, as if the very light used to capture their image was bent and warped by their presence. Their forms are clear, their clothing rendered in sharp detail, but their identities are wiped clean, erased by a strange photographic fog. The most disturbing element, however, is visible only upon close inspection under the focused beam of a modern lamp: the eyes. Within the smoky blur of each face, the eyes are rendered with a terrifying clarity, but they are not singular. In the place of each iris and pupil, the daguerreotype has captured 2 overlapping images. It appears as if a second set of eyes, narrower and more predatory, is looking out from directly behind the first. It is not a simple double exposure, an error in the photographic process. The secondary eyes are perfectly aligned with the first, a seamless and horrifying fusion of gazes. They all share this trait, from Hezekiah down to the smallest child. It is a shared physical anomaly that marks them as something other, something profoundly unnatural. The image suggests a dual nature, a placid human mass concealing a monstrous reality just beneath the surface. This single surviving photograph became the focal point of the community's fear, a piece of tangible proof that the family on the ridge was not merely reclusive, but fundamentally different. With the circulation of the daguerreotype, the family's reputation for strangeness solidified into something far darker. The community's avoidance of them became a rigid, unspoken law. The final pillars of this dark reputation were put in place by the 2 figures who represented the ultimate authorities in such an isolated place: the doctor and the preacher. Their verdicts, delivered separately but with equal gravity, sealed the family's isolation and condemned them in the eyes of the populace. These were not men given to flights of fancy. They were pillars of the community, their words carrying the weight of both scientific reason and divine judgment. Dr. Ephraim was a man of science, a graduate of a respectable Philadelphia medical college who believed in rational explanations for the afflictions of the body and mind. He was summoned to the ridge by a frantic, breathless neighbor who claimed one of the family's children had been seen convulsing near the property line. Driven by his oath and a professional curiosity he would later curse, Dr. Ephraim made the arduous journey up the overgrown path to the homestead. He recorded in his private journal that the air grew colder and heavier with each step, the natural sounds of the forest falling away into an oppressive silence. He was met at the door not by Hezekiah, but by the wife, a woman whose face he could not later recall, describing it only as a collection of shifting planes and shadows. He was led inside the cabin, into a gloom that the single, sputtering lantern did little to dispel. The interior was unnervingly sparse, devoid of any of the small comforts or personal effects that signal human habitation. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, a cloying metallic odor he could not identify. The children were there, silent and still, their eyes tracking his every movement. He saw no sign of the convulsing child. When he inquired, the wife simply stated that the boy was well now. Dr. Ephraim, determined to make some assessment, knelt to examine the youngest child, a small boy of perhaps 5 or 6 years. The boy did not flinch or resist. He remained perfectly placid, his skin cold and waxy to the touch. As the doctor leaned in, he saw his own reflection in the boy's unnervingly dark pupils, but the reflection was not of him kneeling. It was of him standing, his back turned, as if he were walking away. Deeply unsettled, he quickly concluded his examination, finding no discernible ailment, yet feeling a profound sense of sickness himself. He told the wife that there was nothing he could do for them. As he fled the cabin and hurried back down the path, he felt their eyes on his back, a physical pressure that did not relent until he was safely back in the familiar light of the valley. He later informed the town's mayor that the family on the ridge was afflicted with a malady that no medicine could cure, and he warned that it was a contagion of the spirit, not the flesh. Reverend Michael, a devout man who believed firmly in the grace of God and the pervasive evil of the devil, felt a different kind of duty. He saw the family as a lost flock, souls to be saved from the darkness of their isolation. He resolved to visit them, to bring the word of God to a place that seemed to have been forgotten by heaven. He walked the path to the homestead one bright Sunday morning, his Bible clutched in his hand. But he never reached the front door. He described later, in a letter to his bishop, that he was stopped at the edge of the cleared land by what he could only describe as a wall of spiritual despair. It was, he wrote, a palpable barrier of coldness and blasphemy, a presence so antithetical to the faith he held that it physically repelled him. He stood there for nearly an hour, praying for the strength to continue, but his every prayer felt hollow, swallowed by a vast and hungry emptiness that emanated from the dark log cabin. He saw one of the children watching him from a narrow window, its face a pale blur in the shadows. The child did not wave or make a sound. It simply watched, its gaze conveying a chilling and ancient intelligence. The Reverend, a man who had faced down drunkards and stared into the faces of the dying without fear, was overcome by a terror so profound that his faith momentarily faltered. He turned and walked away, defeated. He reported to his congregation that the family on the ridge answered to a different authority, a patriarch of their own bloodline who was beholden to no God he recognized. He declared their home to be unconsecrated ground, a place where prayers went unanswered, and he forbade any member of his flock from ever setting foot upon it. The pronouncements of the doctor and the preacher were the final confirmation of what the community had long suspected. The family was not just different, they were a blight, a source of sickness and godlessness that had taken root in their midst. The whispers and rumors were no longer sufficient. The growing list of strange occurrences, of missing livestock and unnerving sounds, demanded a more formal accounting. It was the town clerk, a meticulous man named Silas, who had a deep respect for the written record, who took it upon himself to begin the chronicle. In a new, leather-bound ledger, separate from the official town records, he began to document the incidents connected to the family on the ridge. He began with the story of the vanished peddler, whose cart and its unsettling photographic contents were the first tangible pieces of the puzzle. He then recorded the accounts of moved property lines, poisoned springs, and the impossibly clean bones of vanished livestock. He solicited testimony, writing down the stories of farmers and their wives, noting the dates and times of the strange nocturnal sounds. His ledger became a secret history of the town's fear, a methodical compilation of the family's quiet reign of terror. The first entry he made under the heading of Disappearances of Persons was that of a local trapper, a man named Bartholomew, who was last seen checking his snares along the base of the ridge. His traps were found sprung and empty, his rifle leaning against a tree, but of Bartholomew himself there was no trace. With that simple entry, a new chapter of the family's dark story began, one that would be written not just in whispers and rumors, but in the indelible ink of a growing list of the lost. The ledger kept by Silas, the town clerk, grew heavier with each passing season. What had begun as a record of peculiarities and minor transgressions was slowly transforming into a chronicle of profound and inexplicable misfortune. The invisible perimeter of fear around the family's ridge expanded, its chilling influence seeping down into the valley like a ground fog, touching the lives of those who had never even laid eyes on the patriarch, Hezekiah, or his silent, watchful children. The community's quiet apprehension began to fester into a deep-seated dread, as it became clear that the family's presence was not merely unsettling, but actively hostile to the life and health of the valley itself. The misfortunes were no longer isolated incidents. They were beginning to form a constellation of tragedy, with the dark house on the ridge at its unblinking center. The first sign of this new, more virulent phase of their influence was an illness that took hold of the children living in the homesteads nearest the ridge. It was a sickness that defied all of Dr. Ephraim's training and experience. It did not present with the familiar signs of fever, rash, or catarrh that he knew so well. Instead, it was an ailment of subtraction. The afflicted children, once vibrant and full of the chaotic energy of youth, would become placid and unnervingly quiet. A deep lethargy would settle over them, their limbs growing heavy, their eyes losing their focus. They would sit for hours, staring at a fixed point on the wall or out a window, their expressions blank and unreadable. When their parents tried to rouse them, they would respond with a slow, languid turn of the head, their gaze seemingly looking through the person before them, as if they were listening to a distant conversation. The Woolbright family, whose farm was situated in the very shadow of the ridge, was the first to be struck. Their two youngest, a boy named Samuel and a girl named Patience, had been seen playing near the creek that marked the informal boundary of their land, the same creek whose waters originated from the high ground of the family's property. Days later, they both succumbed to the strange listlessness. Their father, Obadiah Woolbright, was a man known for his gentle hand with animals, able to calm the most skittish mare with a soft word and a steady touch. He was a man of simple faith and profound paternal love, and the sight of his children fading before his eyes hollowed him out from the inside. He would sit by their bedsides, telling them stories and singing the simple hymns they had once loved, but their eyes remained distant, their minds seemingly adrift on a silent, colorless sea. He said it was as if their souls were being drawn out of them, slowly and deliberately, leaving behind only the frailest of shells. Other families soon reported the same affliction. Children who had once filled the valley with their shouts and laughter fell silent. They ceased to play, to eat, to respond. They simply sat, waiting for something that never seemed to arrive. The sickness was a quiet thief, stealing not the breath from their lungs, but the spark from their spirits. Dr. Ephraim visited each home, his medical bag filled with remedies that proved utterly useless. He found no physical cause for their condition. Their breathing was steady. Their hearts beat with a regular, if faint, rhythm. But a profound pallor had taken hold of their skin, a translucent, waxy quality that made them look like porcelain dolls. The most unsettling symptom, which he noted in the margins of his journal with a trembling hand, was that all the afflicted children, when they did sleep, did not close their eyes. They would lie in their beds, their bodies still, but their eyes would remain open, staring up at the ceiling in the dark, as if watching a silent pageant unfold above them. While the quiet plague of the children unfolded, a more abrupt and shocking tragedy struck the community. A farmer named Phineas, a sturdy and reliable man who had worked his land for 2 decades, vanished. His farm was adjacent to Jedediah's, the man whose property lines had been inexplicably moved. Phineas had been a man of routine, his days governed by the rising and setting of the sun. On a crisp autumn afternoon, he had gone out to his westernmost field to complete the final harvest of the year, a plot of land that bordered the dense, thorny thicket at the base of the ridge. His wife, Elspeth, called him for supper as dusk began to settle, but received no reply. When he did not return by nightfall, she gathered a few neighbors, and they went out with lanterns to search for him. They found the scene of his labor frozen in time. His scythe was resting against a half-cut shock of wheat, its blade still gleaming in the lantern light. His whetstone and a small water skin lay beside it, placed neatly on a flat rock. A few paces away, his burlap sack for carrying the harvested grain was half full, its opening still propped up by a forked stick. The earth around the area was undisturbed, save for Phineas's own footprints. There was no sign of a struggle, no tracks of a wild animal, no indication of any other human presence. It was as if he had been in the middle of a familiar, practiced motion, had paused to wipe his brow, and had simply ceased to exist. The search party combed the field and the surrounding woods for hours, their calls echoing unanswered in the oppressive stillness that seemed to bleed from the ridge. Phineas was never seen again. His tools, left in the middle of his final task, became a stark and silent monument to his disappearance, a chilling tableau that spoke of a departure that was both instantaneous and absolute. The confluence of the spreading sickness and the vanishing of Phineas created a new level of crisis in the valley. A delegation of farmers, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion, came to Dr. Ephraim's door, pleading with him to do something. They were convinced the source of their troubles was the family on the ridge. They spoke of the unnatural silence of the children and the impossible neatness of Phineas's disappearance, arguing that these were not acts of God or of nature, but of a human malevolence that had to be confronted. Weighed down by his own sense of failure and a growing dread that transcended his scientific understanding, Dr. Ephraim agreed to make a second visit to the homestead. He felt it was his duty, but it was a duty he accepted with the grim resignation of a man walking to his own scaffold. His second journey up the ridge was even more disquieting than the first. He found the path more overgrown, the thorny vines reaching across it like grasping fingers. The silence was deeper, the air colder. This time Hezekiah himself answered the door, filling the frame with his gaunt, intimidating presence. His eyes, those strange, light-absorbing voids, fixed on the doctor, and Ephraim felt a tremor of pure, primal fear. He stated his purpose directly, explaining that an illness was affecting the children in the valley, and that he needed to rule out any source of contagion from the ridge. Hezekiah did not speak. He simply stepped aside, a gesture of admission that felt more like a trap being sprung. The interior of the cabin was, as he remembered it, dark, cold, and unnervingly barren. The children were there again, seated on low, rough-hewn stools, arranged in a semicircle. They were perfectly still, their hands folded in their laps. As he stepped into the center of the room, they all turned their heads in perfect unison to look at him. The eerie, milky blur that had so distorted their faces in the daguerreotype seemed to be a physical quality, as if he were viewing them through a heat haze. He approached the nearest child, a girl of about 7 or 8, and knelt before her. He tried to speak to her, to ask her name, but the words died in his throat. Her eyes, like the eyes of all her siblings, held that terrifying double image he had first seen in the photograph. But this time, as he looked into them, he did not see a simple reflection of himself. He saw a warped and horrifying tableau. He saw his own examining room, but it was covered in dust and cobwebs, the glass of his medicine bottles shattered. He saw a reflection of his own face, but it was aged by decades, his features twisted in a mask of silent, screaming madness. The vision lasted only a second, but it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He recoiled, stumbling backward. He looked from one child to the next, and in the dark, doubled pupils of each, he saw other, equally terrible reflections. He saw the church burning, its steeple toppling into a sea of flames. He saw the fields of his neighbors sown with salt, barren and gray under a perpetually sunless sky. He saw a long line of coffins, small and large, being lowered into the earth of the town cemetery. It was a vision of a future that the silent, staring children seemed to be projecting directly into his mind. Hezekiah had not moved from the doorway, his silhouette blocking the only source of light. He finally spoke, his voice a dry rustle, like dead leaves skittering across stone. He said the doctor's medicine was of no use to them, and that the valley's afflictions were a matter for the valley's people to resolve. It was not a threat, but a statement of fact, a declaration of their complete and total detachment from the consequences of their own existence. Dr. Ephraim turned and fled, not stopping until he reached the bottom of the ridge, his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind reeling from the prophetic, malevolent images that had been burned into his memory. At the same time, Reverend Michael was undertaking his own investigation, turning not to the physical world, but to the written records of his parish. He locked himself in the small sacristy of his church, pulling out the old, leather-bound registers that contained the vital statistics of the community for the past 50 years. The pages were brittle, the iron gall ink faded to a ghostly brown. He was searching for a pattern, a historical precedent for the darkness that now gripped his flock. He began with the year the family had arrived on the ridge, cross-referencing the dates of deaths with the proximity of the deceased's home to the ridge. What he found chilled him to the bone. In the decade prior to the family's settlement, there had been only 3 recorded deaths in the households bordering the ridge, all from easily identifiable causes, one from childbirth, one from a snake bite, and one from the influenza of 1872. But in the years following their arrival, the number began to climb at an alarming rate. He found records of entire families being wiped out over the course of a single winter. The cause of death, in the rare instances it was recorded by his predecessor, was listed with vague, archaic terms like wasting sickness, failure of the spirit, or a deep melancholy. In more than a dozen cases, the space for the cause of death was simply left blank, an empty line that spoke of a bafflement and fear so profound that the previous reverend had not even dared to speculate. These were not the records of a community experiencing natural hardship. They were the records of a community slowly and systematically being hollowed out from its edges, the decay spreading inward from the dark heart of the ridge. The revelations from the doctor and the preacher, combined with the growing number of sick children and the unsolved disappearance of Phineas, was the final catalyst. The families living nearest the ridge began to abandon their land. It was not a panicked rout, but a somber, funereal retreat. The Woolbrights were the first to leave. One morning, their neighbors awoke to find their cabin empty, the door swinging gently in the breeze. Obadiah had left a note with his closest neighbor. It did not speak of illness or fear of violence. He wrote that his children had started speaking in their sleep, not with their own voices, but with a second, deeper voice that overlapped their own, whispering in a language he did not understand. He claimed the family on the ridge did not carry a plague of the body, but a blight that fed on the soul, and that his only hope of saving what was left of his children was to put as much distance as possible between them and that cursed ground. One by one, other families followed. The smoke from their chimneys ceased to rise. Their fields, once tended with care, became overgrown with weeds. Their livestock was sold for a fraction of its worth or simply turned loose into the woods. The slow, methodical process of settlement and cultivation that had defined the valley for a generation was being undone in a matter of months. The abandoned homestead stood as silent, decaying testaments to the family's corrosive influence. Children's toys were left half buried in the dirt of the yards, and curtains, bleached by the sun, fluttered in the broken panes of windows. A creeping silence fell over the eastern side of the valley, a dead zone where no one dared to venture. The ridge and the dark house that crowned it now presided over a landscape of failure and retreat, its dominion solidified not by force of arms, but by a quiet, patient, and utterly implacable evil. The sight of their neighbors fleeing their homes, and the growing number of unmarked graves in the churchyard finally galvanized the rest of the community. Their fear, which had for so long been a private, whispered affair, now found a collective voice. They realized that this was not a problem that could be ignored or outlasted. The blight was spreading. The complete abandonment of a quarter of the valley's settled land was a wound they could not sustain. If the doctor could not heal them, and the preacher could not save them, they would turn to the only remaining authority they had, the law. A town meeting was held, and the decision was made. The county sheriff would be summoned. He would be asked to go up to the ridge, to confront the family, and to put an end to the long reign of terror that had brought their small, once hopeful world to the brink of collapse. This appeal to secular authority represented a final, desperate attempt to impose the rational order of men upon a darkness that seemed to obey no laws but its own. The arrival of Sheriff Theron in the valley was initially seen as a moment of deliverance. He was a man whose reputation preceded him, a figure of solid, unyielding authority in a territory still wrestling with its own lawlessness. He was not a native of the mountains, but an outsider appointed by the state, which lent him an aura of impartial power. Theron was a pragmatist, a man who believed that most of the world's evils could be solved with a firm hand and the unambiguous application of the law. His one small vanity was the meticulous care he took of his sidearm and the heavy leather gun belt it rested in. He would spend a portion of each evening cleaning and oiling the leather, the repetitive, methodical action, a personal ritual that reinforced his belief in order and maintenance. To the fearful residents of the valley, this man, with his steady gaze and the glint of his polished badge, represented the last and best hope of a world set right. He listened to the town elders in the starkly furnished back room of the general store, his expression unreadable. They recounted the litany of misfortunes, the strange sickness of the children, the abandoned farms, the inexplicable disappearance of Phineas. They showed him the daguerreotype, its tarnished silver surface reflecting the worried faces of the men around the table. Sheriff Theron examined the image with a critical eye, his gaze lingering on the blurred features and the unsettling anomaly of the doubled eyes. He did not dismiss their fears, but neither did he fully endorse them. He spoke in a low, measured tone, stating that fear was a poor witness, but that a missing man and abandoned property were matters of legal fact. He assured them he would ride up to the ridge the following morning and make an official inquiry. His calm professionalism was a balm to the frayed nerves of the delegation. For the first time in months, they felt that the chaotic darkness that had descended upon them might be forced to answer to the clear, bright light of the law. The next day, Sheriff Theron made the journey alone. He was not a man who required a posse for an initial investigation. He rode his horse as far as the overgrown path would allow, the animal growing increasingly skittish as they drew nearer to the ridge. He dismounted and tied the reins to a low-hanging branch, the horse pulling back, its eyes wide. The silence that had so unnerved Dr. Ephraim and Reverend Michael settled upon the sheriff as well, but he interpreted it not as a spiritual void but as a tactical consideration. The silence meant he could be heard from a long way off. He proceeded on foot, his hand resting naturally on the grip of his pistol. The dark, steep-roofed cabin came into view, a jagged silhouette against the gray sky. It looked less like a home and more like a geological formation, an outcropping of the rock and shadow that composed the ridge itself. He did not call out. He walked directly to the front door, his footsteps heavy on the packed earth. The door was ajar, a narrow sliver of profound darkness visible within. He stopped before it, his presence announced and deliberate. After a long moment, the door swung inward, revealing the gaunt figure of Hezekiah. The patriarch was just as the townspeople had described him, tall and skeletal, his eyes seeming to drink the daylight. He held a long, hand-carved wooden staff, its surface worn smooth with use. Sheriff Theron was a man who had faced down armed fugitives and quelled drunken brawls, but he felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. It was the absolute lack of fear in the other man's eyes that was so disarming. Hezekiah did not look surprised, or angry, or defensive. He looked as if he were observing a minor predictable natural event, like a change in the wind. The sheriff stated his name and his office. He explained he was there to inquire about the disappearance of a man named Phineas and to ask about the reports of disturbances affecting the valley. He spoke with the full weight of his legal authority, his voice a clear and steady instrument of the state. Hezekiah listened without expression. He did not answer the questions directly. Instead, he simply gestured with his staff toward the interior of the cabin, a silent invitation. Through the open doorway, Sheriff Theron could see the children. They were arranged in the same unnatural stillness that Dr. Ephraim had described, their pale faces turned toward the door. The gloom inside was so thick that they appeared as ghostly, indistinct shapes. But there was something else in the room, something in the far corner, half hidden in the deepest shadows. It was a shape that did not resolve, a construction of wood and shadow that seemed to writhe at the edges of his vision. He caught a fleeting impression of vertical bars, of something moving slowly behind them, but his mind refused to process what he was seeing. It was a detail so alien to his understanding of a family home that it felt like a brief, waking nightmare. Hezekiah then spoke a single sentence, his voice as dry and devoid of emotion as the rustle of a snake through dead leaves. He said that their affairs were their own and that the valley's troubles were born of the valley's own weakness. He then slowly, deliberately, began to close the door. Sheriff Theron did not move to stop him. He did not draw his weapon. He did not assert his authority. In that moment, he understood that the law he represented was a fragile, human construct, a set of rules for a world that operated on shared assumptions of reality. What was inside that cabin, what was embodied in the silent patriarch and his watchful, double-eyed children, was something that existed outside of that compact. It was a form of sovereignty so ancient and absolute that his badge and his gun were rendered meaningless symbols. He turned around before the door had fully clicked shut and walked back down the path, the feeling of the children's eyes on his back, a physical weight. When he returned to the town, he was a changed man. The solid certainty that had been his defining characteristic was gone, replaced by a haunted, evasive silence. He met with the town elders and informed them that Phineas was not on the ridge, and that the family was to be left alone. When they pressed him for details, demanding to know what he had seen, he refused to speak. He looked at them with a strange, pitying expression. and said that some things, once seen, could not be translated into words. He told them his report to the county would state that the case was closed due to a lack of evidence. He packed his saddlebags that same evening and rode out of the valley before dawn, never to return. His abrupt departure and his cryptic, terrifying silence were a more profound blow to the community than any open threat from the family could have been. The law had not failed, it had surrendered. It had looked into the darkness on the ridge and had chosen to walk away, leaving the people of the valley to their fate. The second pillar of external authority to crumble was that of the federal government, in the unassuming form of a census taker named Alden. He arrived in the valley a few years after the sheriff's departure, part of the decennial effort to count and categorize the nation's populace. Alden was a man who found a deep, aesthetic pleasure in order. He had a precise, elegant script, and the ledger he carried was a model of neat columns and clean lines. This meticulousness was his defining human detail, a belief that the world, in all its chaotic variety, could be understood if it was properly measured and recorded. He saw himself as a quiet servant of progress, a cartographer of the growing American family. The valley, with its abandoned farms and its atmosphere of hushed fear, was a disquieting anomaly in his work, but he was determined to fulfill his duties with his usual thoroughness. When he inquired about the family on the ridge, he was met with warnings and pleas to leave them be. But the law required every household to be counted, and Alden was a man who followed the law. He made the journey up the path, his ledger tucked securely under his arm. He was not met at the door. Instead, the wife's voice, a thin and reedy sound, called out to him from one of the narrow, slit-like windows. He was not to come any closer, she said. He could ask his questions from where he stood. Shouting across the barren yard, Alden conducted the strangest interview of his career. He asked for the head of household, the number of residents, their names, and their ages. The woman's voice provided the information flatly, without emotion or hesitation. He dutifully recorded the names: Hezekiah, the patriarch, a wife named Amarantha, and 4 children, Obed, Elara, Malachi, and Zillah. He wrote down their ages as she gave them, and then, his task complete, he retreated from the oppressive silence of the ridge. It was only later that evening, as he was compiling his notes and cross-referencing them with the records from the previous census of a decade earlier, that he made his chilling discovery. The town clerk, Silas, had kept the old federal ledgers, and Alden laid them open next to his own. He found the entry for the family from 10 years prior. The names were identical: Hezekiah, Amarantha, Obed, Elara, Malachi, and Zillah. His pen froze over the page as he compared the ages. According to the previous census, the boy named Obed had been 12 years old. The information he had been given that very day also listed Obed's age as 12. The girl, Elara, had been 10. She was still 10. The 2 youngest, Malachi and Zillah, had been 7 and 5 respectively. A full decade had passed, yet according to the official record he had just taken, their ages had remained absolutely impossibly static. Alden's first reaction was one of professional irritation. He assumed the woman had been lying, or that the previous census taker had made a gross error. But as he sat there, the 2 ledgers opened before him. Another, more disturbing possibility began to take root in his mind. He recalled the unnerving quality of the voice from the window, its lack of any human inflection. He thought of the warnings from the townspeople. The numbers on the page, in their stark, black and white authority, were testifying to a suspension of the laws of nature. Children did not simply stop aging. Time did not stand still on that ridge. Yet the data, the cold, hard facts that he treasured above all else, insisted that it did. A profound sense of dread washed over him. He felt as if he had stumbled upon a secret that was not meant for human knowledge, a tear in the very fabric of reality. He closed the ledgers, but he could not close his mind to the implication. The family on the ridge was not merely outside the law of man. They were outside the law of time itself. He completed his report for the valley, but when he came to the entry for the family, he simply copied the information from the previous census, a silent act of surrender to an anomaly he could neither comprehend nor contest. The official record of the United States government now contained a quiet, statistical lie, a concession that the truth of that family was too monstrous to be written down. The final authority to be broken was the spiritual one, embodied by Reverend Michael. The failure of the sheriff and the impossible data of the census taker had only deepened his own sense of guilt and responsibility. He felt he had abandoned his flock to a spiritual predator, and his inability to confront the evil on the ridge became a corrosive obsession. He filled the pages of his private diary with frantic looping script, theological arguments with himself, and prayers for a divine intervention that never came. He became a gaunt, haunted figure, his sermons growing more fervent and filled with dark allusions to wolves in the fold and to evils that walk in the darkness. He felt that if he could not defeat the family, he must at least understand the nature of their power. Driven by this need, he undertook one last clandestine journey to the ridge. He did not go in the light of day with his Bible held before him, but at dusk, moving like a thief through the woods that bordered their property. He found a hiding place in a rocky crevice that offered a clear view of the cabin and the cleared yard before it. As the last light of the sun bled from the sky, he witnessed a scene that would forever haunt his waking and sleeping hours. The family emerged from the cabin, not one by one, but together, moving in a silent, coordinated unit. They formed a straight line facing the darkening east, with Hezekiah at the head. The patriarch began to speak. His voice was too low for the reverend to make out the words, but the cadence was not that of human speech. It was a series of low, resonant clicks and deep, guttural vibrations, a language that seemed designed for the throat of something not quite human. After each phrase uttered by Hezekiah, the wife and children would respond. They did not speak. They responded with a single, synchronized, and deeply unnatural movement. They would tilt their heads to the left at a sharp, bird-like angle, their bodies remaining perfectly rigid. The motion was so precise, so utterly devoid of individual variation, that it was like watching a single organism with multiple bodies. They were a unified entity, a hive mind responding to its queen. As the ritual continued, the Reverend felt a profound and terrifying revelation coalesce in his mind. He understood the statement recorded years ago by his predecessor, who had claimed the family insisted they answered only to their own blood. He was witnessing the ultimate expression of that creed. This was not a family in any recognizable sense. It was a dynasty, a self-contained and self-perpetuating faith whose only deity was its own lineage. Their blood was their church, their patriarch was their priest, and their shared, monstrous nature was their God. Reverend Michael crept away from his hiding place, his soul colder and heavier than the stone he had been hiding behind. He had sought understanding and had found only a more profound and unassailable horror. He had seen their truth. They were complete in themselves, a closed circle that no outside power could penetrate. His diary entry for that night was his last coherent piece of writing. He recorded what he had seen and concluded with a single, despairing line. He wrote that one cannot save a soul that does not believe it is lost, and that the family on the ridge was not lost at all, but was, in fact, precisely where it belonged. The failure of the law, the government, and the church was now complete. The community, having exhausted every avenue of appeal to the outside world, finally and irrevocably turned its back on the ridge. The path became entirely consumed by the thorny brush. The abandoned farms at its base were left to rot, their collapsing structures a permanent buffer zone between the world of men and the world of the family. The ridge became a place that existed only in cautionary tales told to frightened children, a blank space on the mental map of the valley. After dusk, a curtain of silence and fear was drawn around the base of the mountain, a self-imposed quarantine. The family had won. They had not conquered the valley with violence or force, but had simply endured. Their terrible patience and profound otherness, an acid that had dissolved every attempt to control them. They were now truly alone, shrouded in a mythology of their own making, waiting in the oppressive quiet for whatever dark season was to come next. For years, the ridge remained a place of absolute isolation, a dead note in the quiet hymn of valley life. The family's victory was so complete that they receded from the forefront of the community's consciousness, becoming less of an active threat and more of a foundational horror, a piece of dark folklore woven into the very identity of the place. Children were warned away from the overgrown paths with stories of the silent children who did not age, and the memory of Phineas's vanishing became a cautionary tale about the dangers of straying too far from the familiar light of the settlement. The dark, steep-roofed cabin on the high ground stood as a monument to this communal forgetting, a place so thoroughly expunged from the daily lives of the people that it might as well have been on the surface of the moon. This quiet, uneasy truce, born of fear and resignation, was shattered on a windless night in late autumn by the one element that no one, not even the family in their fortress of shadow, could fully control: fire. The glow was first noticed by a farmer on the far western side of the valley, a man named Silas, the son of the town clerk who had first started the secret ledger. He had stepped outside to check on a mare who was close to foaling, a small act of husbandry that had been a part of his family's life for generations. He was a man who took a quiet, profound comfort in the familiar rhythms of the land, the scent of hay in the barn, the low murmur of his sleeping cattle. As he stood under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the night sky, his gaze was drawn eastward, toward the black, serrated line of the ridge. A flicker of unnatural orange pulsed against the darkness, a malevolent ember lodged in the heart of the mountain. It was not the clean, contained light of a lantern or a hearth fire. This was a wilder, more chaotic light, a hungry incandescence that seemed to be consuming the very darkness it illuminated. He watched for a long moment, the mare forgotten, a cold dread creeping into his bones. The light grew, painting the underside of a low-hanging cloud with a bruised, bloody palette. There was no doubt. The house on the ridge was burning. He did not raise the alarm. His first instinct was not to help, but to retreat, to bar his door and pray that whatever was happening on that unholy ground would stay there. This was the conditioned response of a generation that had learned that the safest course of action regarding the ridge was inaction. But the fire was a spectacle of such terrible beauty that it defied being ignored. Others saw it, stepping out of their homes, drawn by the silent, ominous beacon. A small crowd gathered at the edge of the settlement, their faces upturned, their nightshirts and shawls pale shapes in the flickering, distant light. They stood in silence, a congregation of reluctant witnesses. There was no talk of forming a bucket brigade, no cries of alarm. They simply watched, their emotions a complex and guilty mixture of terror and a terrible, unspoken relief. They were watching a cancer being cauterized from the landscape, a violent and long overdue act of purification. They stood there for hours, until the terrible orange blossom of the fire began to fade, leaving behind a dying, red pulse that finally winked out as the first anemic light of dawn touched the eastern sky. Later that morning, a small party of men, led by the same Silas who had first seen the blaze, decided to ascend the ridge. Their motives were not born of concern, but of a morbid, pressing need to see the aftermath, to confirm with their own eyes that the long reign of the family was truly over. The group was composed of the town's most solid and respectable citizens, Silas, the blacksmith, and the pastor who had inherited Reverend Michael's church and his predecessor's warnings. They moved with a grim, funereal purpose, their initial trepidation warring with a powerful, magnetic curiosity. As they climbed, the familiar silence of the ridge was punctuated by a new sound, the soft hiss and crackle of cooling embers. The air, which had always been cold and heavy, was now thick with the acrid smell of burnt pine and something else, a deeply unsettling organic odor, like roasted meat left too long on the spit. The homestead was a ruin, a skeleton of blackened timbers stark against the morning sky. The fire had been incredibly hot, consuming the northern wing of the cabin almost entirely, leaving only the stone chimney stack and a few charred support beams. The steep roof had collapsed inward, creating a smoldering pit of ash and debris. It was a scene of absolute desolation. There was no sign of the family. No bodies were immediately visible in the wreckage, and the men assumed that they had either escaped or been completely consumed by the inferno. The pastor said a brief, uncertain prayer for the dead, his words feeling hollow and inadequate in the face of such a strange and violent end. For a moment, it seemed as if the story had concluded, the evil purged by a final, fiery judgment. But it was what they discovered as they began to pick through the charred remains that revealed the true and horrifying nature of the life that had been lived within those walls. It was the blacksmith who found the cages. He was examining a section of the interior wall that had been exposed when the outer logs had burned away. He noticed a series of small, square openings, evenly spaced and set deep within the thick wall itself. Curious, he pulled away a large piece of charred timber and peered into the darkness behind it. He recoiled with a choked cry. Built into the very structure of the house, like a hornet's nest integrated into a tree, was a row of small, iron-barred cages. They were no more than 3 feet square, too small for an adult to stand or lie down in, designed for nothing more than cramped, miserable confinement. The iron was hand-wrought, the work of a skilled but malicious craftsman. The locking mechanisms were heavy and complex, operable only from the outside. There were stains on the wooden floors of the cages, dark and deep, and the blacksmith, who had seen his share of slaughtered animals, knew he was looking at old blood. The discovery cast a sickening pall over the scene. The house had not just been a home, it had been a prison. While the others were still reeling from the implications of the cages, Silas made a discovery of his own in another, less damaged part of the structure. Tucked inside a small, fire-scorched metal box, he found a journal. It was a thick, leather-bound volume, its cover warped by the heat, but its contents miraculously preserved. The script inside was a shock. It was not the crude scrawl of a barely literate backwoodsman. The handwriting was precise, elegant, and almost unnervingly uniform, as if each letter had been drawn by a draftsman rather than written by a human hand. The entries were not dated in any conventional way, but were marked by celestial observations, noting the phases of the moon and the position of certain stars. The language was cold, detached, and clinical. It was a record of observations, a scientific logbook of the damned. The journal listed the names of dozens of individuals. Silas recognized many of them. He saw the name of Phineas, the farmer who had vanished from his field years ago. He saw the name of the peddler whose cart had been found wrecked on the mountain road. He saw the names of entire families who had been recorded in the old church registers as having died from wasting sicknesses. Beside each name were a series of meticulous notes, observations on their physical and psychological resilience. The words experiment and subject were used repeatedly. Phineas was listed as subject 17, and the notes detailed his response to sensory deprivation and prolonged isolation. The peddler was subject 12, with entries describing his reactions to certain auditory frequencies. The children who had suffered from the strange, listless sickness were not named, but there was a lengthy section on the observed effects of psychic leeching on juvenile subjects in the adjacent valley. The journal was the cold, unblinking confession of a monster, a record of systematic, scientific cruelty on a scale that shattered the comprehension of the men who stood there, their faces pale in the smoky morning air. The final, and in many ways most heartbreaking, discovery was made beneath the floorboards of the main room. A section of the floor had burned through, revealing a shallow cellar beneath. The cellar was not filled with preserves or stored goods. It was filled, almost to the brim, with shoes. Dozens and dozens of pairs of children's shoes. They were of all sizes, from the tiny, soft-soled booties of an infant to the sturdy, worn leather shoes of a boy on the cusp of adolescence. They were caked in dirt and grime, but they were unmistakably children's shoes. The men stared down into the pit, a silent, terrible understanding dawning on them. Silas, who knew the town records better than any man alive, recognized a small, distinctive pair with a silver buckle that had belonged to Patience Woolbright, one of the first children to fall to the strange sickness before her family had fled. None of these shoes had belonged to the silent, unaging children of the Ridge. They were trophies. They were the final, discarded remnants of the valley's lost sons and daughters, a secret, subterranean testament to a scale of loss that the community had never dared to calculate. The men returned to the valley not with the relief of survivors, but with the heavy, soul-sick burden of witnesses to an atrocity. They carried the fire-scorched journal with them, its contents a poison they now had to contain. A town meeting was called, but the full truth of what they had found was not revealed. To speak of the cages, of the experiments, of the pit of shoes, would have been to unleash a wave of grief and horror that would have shattered the already fragile community. It was too much to bear. A different story was constructed, a narrative that would allow for a semblance of peace. The official report, drafted by Silas and co-signed by the other men, was a masterpiece of deliberate omission. It stated that the fire had been a tragic accident, likely caused by a stray spark from the hearth. It recorded that the family had perished in the blaze, their bodies consumed beyond recognition. It offered a quiet, sanitized closure to a story that was anything but. The journal was not mentioned. It was locked away in the town clerk's safe, a dark secret passed down from father to son, its elegant, monstrous script, a silent testament to the truth that was too terrible to be told. In the aftermath of the fire and the official, falsified report, a strange and perverse thing happened. The Ridge was not abandoned to nature. Within a year, a new structure began to rise from the ashes of the old. From a distance, the townspeople could see the stark, black timbers being hoisted into place. They did not know who was doing the building. No one from the valley was hired for the work, and no one dared to go up and ask. The work was done with an unnatural speed and efficiency, the new house rising like a blight from the scarred earth. The new structure was even larger and more forbidding than the one it replaced. It was a labyrinthine collection of sharp angles and windowless walls, its roofline a jagged wound against the sky. It seemed to have grown rather than been built, a dark, organic expression of the evil that saturated the ground upon which it stood. The rebuilding of the house was the final, terrifying statement of the family's power. It was a declaration that they were not gone. A fire had not purged them. It had merely cleared the way for something worse. The ridge, which had once been a place of fear, was now a place of active, malevolent renewal, its darkness not extinguished, but reborn, darker and more complex than ever before. The second house on the ridge, built upon the ashes of the first, cast a longer and more profound shadow than its predecessor. For several decades, it remained a place of intense speculation and rigorously observed avoidance. The townspeople, having once been burned by the fire of revealed truth, chose to live with the more comforting lie of the official report. They spoke of the newcomers on the ridge, a convenient fiction that allowed them to believe the original evil had perished. Yet no one ever saw these newcomers. No wagons were seen ascending the path. No unfamiliar faces appeared in the general store. The house was rebuilt, and then it simply stood, a silent, brooding presence that seemed to generate its own oppressive atmosphere. The first generation of witnesses to the fire and its terrible discoveries grew old, their secrets held close, their warnings to their children becoming more urgent and tinged with a deep personal horror. The family name, which had been expunged from the public record, was never spoken aloud, but it festered in the collective subconscious of the valley, a wound that had been stitched over but had never truly healed. The bloodline, which the fire was supposed to have extinguished, was merely dormant, waiting for the right moment to surface again, not in the isolation of the ridge, but in the unsuspecting heart of the wider world. The first irrefutable evidence that the family's influence had survived the fire emerged in the 1930s, in the sterile, brightly lit examination rooms of a regional medical clinic several counties away. The evidence came in the form of a series of inexplicable and deeply disturbing pediatric cases that fell under the purview of a young, ambitious medical examiner named Dr. Allister. He was a man of the new century, a believer in genetics and the nascent science of hereditary traits. His humanizing detail was his passion for orchid cultivation, a hobby that spoke to his fascination with the complex and sometimes bizarre expressions of lineage and mutation. He found a deep satisfaction in the predictable Mendelian inheritance of color and form in his flowers, a rational order that he sought to apply to the more chaotic and often tragic world of human pathology. It was this passion for patterns, for tracing traits back to their source, that led him to a discovery that would haunt the remainder of his professional career. He was presented with a series of children from disparate and seemingly unconnected towns across the Appalachian foothills. They all suffered from a unique and terrifying set of congenital deformities. The primary symptom was a peculiar form of ocular dysplasia. The children's eyes were unusually large and dark, with pupils that did not properly react to light. But the most striking feature, visible only under the magnified lens of his ophthalmoscope, was a vestigial, secondary iris that lay behind the primary one, a faint, web-like structure of pigmented tissue that gave their gaze a disturbing, layered depth. It was an anatomical anomaly that had never before been documented in medical literature. Accompanying this ocular abnormality was a consistent pattern of other physical traits: elongated, hyperflexible fingers, an unusual pallor to the skin that did not respond to sun exposure, and a preternatural stillness in their demeanor that bordered on the catatonic. They were beautiful, yet profoundly unsettling children, like flawless porcelain dolls with a single deeply flawed detail that hinted at a monstrous origin. Dr. Allister, driven by his scientific curiosity, began to meticulously map the family histories of each afflicted child. The parents were often poor, transient folk, their genealogies a tangled and poorly documented web of informal unions and forgotten ancestors. For months, his research yielded nothing but frustrating dead ends. The families had no discernible connection to one another. They came from different mining camps, different farming communities, different isolated hollows. He was on the verge of declaring the condition a sporadic and tragic mutation when he stumbled upon a common thread, a piece of geographical information so consistent it could not be a coincidence. He began asking the parents not where they were from, but where their parents and grandparents had been from. In case, after digging back 2 or 3 generations, the same name emerged from the mists of family memory, a small, overlooked valley, and a ridge that loomed over it. His investigation led him to the town, to the office of the current clerk, the grandson of the man who had first started the secret ledger. The clerk, now an old man himself, was the keeper of the town's unwritten history. Dr. Alistair, with his scientific credentials and his gentle, scholarly demeanor, was able to gain his trust. In the dusty, low-lit back room, the old clerk unlocked the safe and removed the fire-scorched journal. He laid it open on the table, its elegant, precise script a stark contrast to the chaotic, hand-scrawled genealogies in Alistair's own notebooks. As the doctor read, a cold understanding began to dawn. The journal, with its chillingly detached descriptions of subjects and experiments, was not just a record of cruelty, it was a breeding ledger. It detailed a systematic, multi-generational program of genetic dissemination. It spoke of certain traits being introduced into the local populace through clandestine unions, of recessive markers being monitored as they spread from one family to another. Hezekiah had not been merely a sadist. He had been a cultivator, a human horticulturalist tending to a garden of corrupted blood. The afflicted children were the fruits of his labor, the blossoming of a genetic blight he had planted decades earlier. The doctor realized with a sickening certainty that the family had not merely survived, they had multiplied, their legacy now invisibly woven into the very DNA of the region. The second echo of the family's enduring presence came decades later, in the 1970s, through the work of a graduate student named Evelyn. She was a sociologist, a young woman with a fervent belief in the power of data to reveal the hidden structures of society. Her chosen field was the study of missing persons cases, a subject she approached not with morbid fascination, but with a rigorous, statistical methodology. Her humanizing quality was her habit of creating a small, hand-drawn portrait of each missing person she studied, a small act of remembrance that kept her connected to the human cost behind the cold numbers. She had amassed a vast database of disappearances across Appalachia, spanning from the early 20th century to the present day. Her goal was to identify patterns, to find geographic or demographic clusters that might point to serial criminal activity or environmental hazards. As she fed her data into the university's mainframe computer, a machine that filled an entire air-conditioned room, a strange and unexpected pattern began to emerge. When she mapped the locations of the disappearances, they were not randomly scattered, nor were they clustered around major highways or urban centers as she had expected. Instead, they formed a vast ethereal spiral. The data points, each representing a human life that had been inexplicably erased, swirled across the map of the mountains like the arms of a ghostly galaxy. And at the very center of this spiral, the point from which all the threads of loss seemed to originate, was a single, insignificant-looking coordinate, a lonely, uninhabited ridge in a quiet, secluded valley. Evelyn, intrigued by this statistical anomaly, traveled to the valley to conduct field work. She found a community that was insular and deeply suspicious of outsiders, a place where the past was a heavy, palpable presence. She spent weeks interviewing the older residents, poring over the town's public records, and walking the perimeter of the abandoned farmland at the base of the ridge. She heard the whispers, The fragmented stories of a strange family that had once lived there, of a fire, and of a dark house that had been rebuilt. The folklore was a tangled mess of half-truths and supernatural embellishments, but it all pointed back to that central, malevolent point on her map. It was during these interviews that she first heard the term hollow bloods. The term was not used lightly. It was spoken in hushed tones, usually after the sun had set, and was always accompanied by a nervous glance toward the ridge. The hollow bloods, as the local folklore described them, were the descendants of the original family. They were not believed to be ghosts, but something far more unsettling. The stories claimed that they did not die in the conventional sense. Instead, when their bodies grew old or were destroyed, their essence, their corrupt and hollow blood, would simply decant into a new vessel. They would return in an altered form, sometimes as a child in a neighboring county, sometimes as a stranger passing through. They could be recognized, the stories said, by their eyes, which seemed to hold a double reflection, and by a profound, unnatural stillness that seemed to suck the warmth from the air around them. Evelyn, a rational academic, initially dismissed these tales as fanciful, the superstitious ramblings of an isolated and uneducated populace. But the term hollow blood stuck with her, a poetic and strangely fitting description for a lineage that seemed to perpetuate itself through absence and loss, its presence defined by the empty spaces it left behind. Her academic skepticism was shaken by her final experience in the valley. On her last day, she decided to hike a portion of the trail that led up the ridge, against the strenuous objections of the town's elderly postmaster. She did not attempt to reach the house, but she wanted to get a feel for the landscape, to see the place that was the statistical epicenter of so much tragedy. As she stood in a small clearing, looking up at the jagged silhouette of the rebuilt structure against the afternoon sky, she felt a sudden and profound sense of being watched. It was a classic trope of horror stories, but for her, it was a palpable, physical sensation, a prickling on her skin and a cold weight in her chest. She scanned the tree line, seeing nothing but the dense, tangled undergrowth. Yet, the feeling persisted, growing in intensity until it became almost unbearable. She turned to leave, and as she did, she heard a sound. It was the sound of a child's laughter, a clear, high-pitched peal that echoed through the silent woods. But it was immediately followed by a second laugh, a deeper, more guttural sound that perfectly mimicked the cadence of the first, the two sounds overlapping in a perfect, horrifying unison. Evelyn fled, not stopping until she was back in the relative safety of the town. She packed her bags and left the valley that same day. She never completed her dissertation on missing persons. The spiral on her map, once a fascinating academic puzzle, had become something monstrous and personal. She could no longer see the data points as mere statistics. They were victims, drawn into a gravitational well of pure evil that had a specific, terrestrial location. The folklore of the hollow bloods and the chilling, doubled laughter she had heard had irrevocably blurred the line between her rational, data-driven world and the older, darker world of myth and inherited fear. The family, she now understood, was not just a historical anomaly or a genetic blight. They were a self-perpetuating phenomenon, a living piece of folklore that actively fed on the world around it, their legacy spreading not just through blood, but through the very stories that were told to warn against them. The work of Dr. Alistair and the aborted research of Evelyn represented two different, yet complementary, attempts to understand the family's legacy. One had traced their influence through the tangible microscopic world of human genetics, revealing a deliberate and patient corruption of the regional bloodline. The other had traced it through the abstract, statistical world of data, revealing a pattern of consumption, of lives being systematically erased in an ever-widening circle of loss. Both had been forced to confront the limits of their respective disciplines. The doctor's science could identify the genetic markers, but could not explain the malevolence behind their creation. The sociologist's data could identify the pattern of disappearance, but could not explain the impossible, doubled laughter in the woods. They had each uncovered a different facet of the family's continued existence, but the full picture remained elusive, a composite of scientific horror and folkloric dread. The Hollow Bloods remained in the shadows, their name a whisper, their presence a statistical certainty, their altered forms now walking, unseen and unrecognized, far beyond the confines of the valley that had been their crucible. The passage of time, which buries so many histories under a gentle blanket of dust and forgetfulness, has had the opposite effect on the story of the family from the ridge. With each new generation of technology, with each new method of inquiry, the past has not receded, but has instead sharpened, its details becoming more vivid and more horrifying. The files on the family, both the official, sanitized records, and the secret whispered accounts, have been revisited by modern researchers, archivists, and journalists. They approach the case armed with a skepticism born of the modern age, a belief that the superstitions and fears of the 19th and 20th centuries can be easily dispelled by the bright, unblinking light of digital analysis and forensic science. Yet, the story has resisted every attempt at final explanation. The evidence, rather than resting quietly in its archival boxes, seems to actively mutate, offering up new and more disturbing revelations, as if the family itself, long gone from the physical world, still exerts a subtle and malevolent influence over the records of its own existence. The family's evil has proven to be not a static artifact of history, but a living, evolving narrative that continues to weave itself into the fabric of the present day. The first of these modern, disquieting revelations came from the original daguerreotype, the small, silver plate, now housed in the climate-controlled archives of a state historical society, was subjected to a high-resolution digital scanning process. The goal was to pierce through the layers of tarnish and the strange, milky blur that had so frustrated previous observers to finally reveal the true faces of Hezekiah and his family. A team of digital archivists, men and women who spent their days coaxing clear images from faded Civil War photographs, approached the task with confidence. The humanizing detail for the lead archivist, a man named Corwin, was his near-obsessive passion for restoring the faces of anonymous soldiers, a belief that giving a name and a clear likeness to the forgotten dead was a form of secular grace. He believed he was performing a similar act of clarification for this strange, isolated family. The initial scans were a failure. The proprietary algorithms designed to sharpen blurred images seemed to have no effect on the daguerreotype. The faces remained obscured by that strange integral fog, a distortion that was not a flaw in the image but a fundamental property of it. Frustrated, Corwin and his team began to experiment with multispectral imaging, a technique that captures light from frequencies beyond the visible spectrum. They scanned the plate in infrared and ultraviolet, feeding the data into a complex layering program. As the new, composite image slowly rendered on the high-definition monitor, a collective intake of breath filled the darkened lab. The faces of the family were still blurred, but the process had revealed something that had been completely invisible to the naked eye for over a century. In the dark, shadowy background behind the Post family, new figures had emerged. They were faint, translucent shapes, like after-images burned onto the photographic plate. There were at least 3 of them, standing among the dark pines at the edge of the clearing. They were not posed for the photograph. They appeared to be observing the scene, their postures predatory and watchful. Their forms were elongated and unnaturally thin, their limbs seeming to bend at impossible angles. Because of their spectral faintness, their features were indistinct, but their silhouettes were profoundly non-human. They did not look like ghosts, apparitions of the dead. They looked like something else entirely, a different order of being, standing just outside the veil of human perception. The archivist stared at the screen, a cold dread seeping into the sterile, climate-controlled air of their lab. They had set out to solve a historical mystery and had instead stumbled upon a piece of evidence that suggested the family was not merely cruel or genetically aberrant. They were keepers of a terrible secret, host to entities that could only be seen in the invisible light of a world beyond our own. The daguerreotype, once a portrait of a strange family, had become a window into a landscape of unimaginable horror. The next modern attempt to penetrate the mystery ended in a more immediate and tragic fashion. A freelance journalist named Elias, a man who had made a name for himself with a series of long-form articles on forgotten American folklore, became obsessed with the story of the Hollow Bloods. He was a creature of the digital age, his primary tools a laptop, a digital audio recorder, and a relentless, cynical curiosity. Elias did not believe in ghosts or curses. He believed in buried stories, in the human truths that lay beneath layers of superstition. His one concession to a world beyond the rational was a small, smooth river stone he always carried in his pocket, a memento from his late father, which he would rub between his thumb and forefinger when he was feeling particularly anxious. It was a small, tactile anchor to a more certain and loving world. Elias traveled to the valley, but unlike his predecessors, he was not interested in the fearful, third-hand accounts of the locals. He intended to be the first person in nearly a century to spend a significant amount of time on the ridge itself, to camp near the ruins of the rebuilt house, and document the environment that had spawned such a durable and terrifying legend. He dismissed the warnings of the few townspeople he spoke to as the predictable resistance of a closed community. He hiked up to the ridge, laden with camping gear and recording equipment, and set up his camp in a small clearing that offered a view of the crumbling stone foundations of the second house. He began his work, taking soil samples, making detailed notes on the unnatural silence of the area, and setting up his sensitive audio equipment to capture the ambient sounds of the night. He was never seen again. When he failed to check in with his editor after 3 days, a search party was organized. They found his campsite, but it was in a state of bizarre disarray. His tent was shredded, not by an animal, but by what appeared to be long, clean cuts from a razor-sharp blade. His equipment was smashed, the delicate lenses of his camera and the sensitive electronics of his recorder shattered into 1,000 pieces. Of Elias himself, there was no trace, not a single footprint leading away from the campsite. The only thing they recovered was his notebook, which was found lying open on a rock, held down by his small, smooth river stone. The last entry was written in a frantic, barely legible scrawl, a stark contrast to the neat, journalistic prose of the preceding pages. The final entry described the first night. Elias wrote that he had been awoken from a deep sleep by a sound. It was a voice, he wrote, a woman's voice, whispering directly into his ear. But he was alone in the tent. The voice was not speaking words, but was making a series of soft, rhythmic clicks and soothing, melodic hums. He was overcome by a profound and unnatural sense of calm, a feeling of blissful surrender. He wrote that he felt as if his very thoughts were being smoothed out, his anxieties and fears gently erased. Then, the entry took a terrifying turn. He described hearing a second voice, a deeper, harsher sound that began to speak over the first. This second voice was not soothing. It was a rasping, guttural sound, and it was speaking in perfect, overlapping unison with the first. The two voices, one beautiful and one monstrous, were coming from the same point in space, a single source that was both seductive and terrifying. The final, spidery line of the entry was a single, chilling phrase. He wrote that they were not trying to scare him. They were trying to empty him, to make room. The notebook ended there. The journalist who had come to demystify the legend had instead become its latest and most articulate victim. The story of the family, bolstered by these new, horrifying modern footnotes, has now settled back into the realm of folklore, but it is a folklore that carries the unnerving weight of documented evidence. The local people of the valley, who have never forgotten the truth of the ridge, continue to be the primary keepers of the oral tradition. Their warnings to travelers and hikers have taken on a new urgency in the wake of the journalist's disappearance. They advise that one should never, under any circumstances, camp within sight of the old homestead's ruins. They claim that the land itself is now hollow, that the silence is not an absence of sound but a presence, a form of listening. They say that the ridge remembers all the voices it has consumed, and that on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can hear them whispering in perfect, terrifying unison with a voice that is not, and has never been, human. The narrative of the family has become a living, breathing entity, a story that refuses to be confined to the past. Each retelling, each new investigation, seems to add another layer to the horror. It is as if the family itself, or the entity it served, wants to be remembered. The story does not fade, it accretes. The digitally revealed figures in the daguerreotype, the chilling final words of the journalist, the enduring folk belief in the hollow bloods. These are not clarifications, but new, more complex and terrifying chapters. The story grows not because of embellishment, but because the central truth of it is so monstrous that it continues to cast new and ever darker shadows upon the present. It suggests that some evils are not vanquished by time, but are merely patient, and that some families are written out of the official histories not because they were unimportant, but because their continued existence, in blood and in story, is a truth too disturbing for the rational world to fully acknowledge. The case file, therefore, remains irrevocably open, a testament to the fact that the darkest corners of the American landscape are not the wild, untamed places, but the ones where a family has put down roots and made a home, turning the soil sour with a darkness that will not, and perhaps cannot, ever be cleansed. The record on the hollow bloods of Appalachia is complete, and your presence through its final, disquieting page means more than you know. If you have just found our archive, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive so you are here when the next file is unsealed. And tell us in the comments how this story and the questions it leaves behind have settled within you.